Okay, let's just jump right in and unpack this. We've been looking at sources that tackle what most people consider the single biggest problem in all of modern science.
The unification problem.
The unification problem. You have general relativity for the very, very large and quantum mechanics for the very, very small. And for the better part of a century, they have just refused to play nicely together.
They seem to be fundamentally at war, you're right. And the really radical insight from the material we're diving into today is that this isn't a failure of math.
Right.
It's not that we're missing an experiment or a bigger particle accelerator. The source argues this is a profound philosophical crisis, an error deep inside the architecture of knowledge itself.
So we've been looking in the wrong place. We're searching for a missing number in an equation when the flaw is in the very concepts we're using to build the equation.
Exactly. That is a massive claim, and it flips the whole problem on its head. It suggests the universe itself is already perfectly coherent. The fault isn't out there, it's in here, in our models.
So this isn't about finding a new theory of everything.
No, the source is saying we need to stop trying to invent it and start trying to recognize a structural necessity that's already there, in existence, just waiting for us to see it correctly.
And the principle for that recognition is something the essay calls Objectively Correct Objectivity. OCO.
OCO, yes. It's the governing principle. It basically mandates that QM and GR aren't separate things to be stitched together. They're interdependent expressions, two poles of a single, unified objective structure. OCO is the rulebook that defines their correct relationship.
So today's deep dive is more of an architectural review than a physics lesson.
That's a perfect way to put it.
We're going to be looking at the dimensional logic, the inherent coherence of nature, as this text describes it. The mission is to get the blueprint right, because the blueprint is fixed, the universe should just become self-evident.
We should emphasize that, yeah, this is all going to be architectural and dimensional. It's about logic, not math. If we can grasp where these theories are supposed to be placed dimensionally, then unification stops being some grand achievement.
It becomes an inevitable conclusion.
An inevitable deduction.
Okay, so let's get into the foundational error that the source points to. It's called the dimensional misplacement. The argument is that modern physics has kind of painted itself into a corner.
It has. It's confined itself to just one slice of reality. The text labels this the third dimension of meaning formation.
Right. So what exactly is this third dimension? What does that mean?
This is the dimension physics knows and loves. It's the domain of nature, the external world. And crucially, it's what the source calls the creation state of consciousness.
The creation state.
Yes, it's the state where we stabilize and objectify meaning. When an idea or a structure achieves permanence, when it becomes an external, measurable thing, it has entered the creation state. It's been created.
So if we're looking at reality only through this one lens, this third dimension, what are the limits? What can't we see?
Well, from that perspective, reality is just objective, a causal, and fundamentally non-living structure. It's a brilliant framework for modeling the what.
The patterns, the laws.
The patterns, the physical laws, the behavior forces, all of it. Physics has built an incredible model of the mechanics of the cosmos from inside this dimension. But, and this is the key, because the third dimension is the effect, it's the creation state, it can never access the cause.
It can model the structure, but it's blind to the origin of that structure.
Blind to the origin and blind to the reason for its existence. It sees the result, but the intentional impulse that started it all is completely invisible.
That's a huge distinction. It's like you can perfectly describe the aerodynamics of a paper airplane, its speed, its trajectory, but you're completely ignoring the mind that folded it and the hand that threw it.
That's a perfect analogy. If physics stays confined to the creation, it will never understand the creator.
And that, according to the source, is why it's incomplete. It's just chopped off two other necessary dimensions.
It's excised them from the model of reality.
Okay, so let's bring in the first missing piece.
Yeah.
The source code. The first dimension. The origin.
The first dimension is the absolute counterpoint to the third. It's the domain of the spirit, the internal world, and it houses the creator state of consciousness.
So if the third is where structure is made manifest.
The first is where the impulse to create originates. It's the source of causality, directionality, and subjective meaning. It's the non-physical, intentional wellspring from which objective reality eventually flows. It answers why reality is structured the way it is.
Okay, but this is where it can sound a bit metaphysical. Or even spiritual. How does the essay keep this in a rigorous philosophical and structural framework so it doesn't just become an appeal to, mystical forces.
And that's where the rigor is so important. The source defines it purely by its structural function. The first dimension is the origin of causality.
Not the chain reaction kind of causality, like A hits B, B hits C.
No, that's third-dimensional causality. The first dimension defines the ultimate directionality of that entire chain. It's the source of the intent that sets the whole system in motion. It's the difference between describing how dominoes fall and describing the initial decision to push the first one.
It grounds the subjective reason in the objective structure.
Exactly.
Okay, so we have the pure intentional origin in the first dimension and the external manifest result in the third. There has to be a bridge. That must be the second dimension, the integrated field.
Absolutely. The second dimension is the existential union. It's the active field where the internal subjective first dimension and the external objective third dimension are constantly recursively balanced.
It's the interaction zone.
It's the feedback loop. The structure influences the intention, and the intention refines the structure. It's where consciousness and matter are perpetually merging and creating coherence.
With this framework, the failure to unify QM and GR suddenly makes a lot more sense.
It becomes almost obvious, doesn't it?
Yeah. If quantum mechanics and general relativity are both just phenomena we observe inside the third dimension, the objective external world, then trying to unify them is like trying to reconcile two different effects without ever looking at the cause.
Precisely. You're trying to solve a three-dimensional problem with a one-dimensional toolkit. When you look at reality exclusively through that non-dualized third-dimensional lens, your perspective is so limited it literally cannot hold both relationality and structure at the same time.
So in the external world, if you focus on relationship, which is QM,
The structural permanence of GR seems to collapse into probability.
and if you enforce structural permanence, like in GR,
The fundamental interconnectedness of QM just vanishes. The contradiction is an artifact. It's manufactured by our incomplete philosophical framework.
so the goal is not to find some new quantum gravity particle. It's to realize that the framework itself is what's forcing these two truths into opposition, when in reality they're just different expressions of a single deeper logic.
It's all about recognizing the structural necessity of the first and second dimensions. Without them, you can't have objective coherence in the third.
Okay, so with that architectural context in place, let's drill down into those two poles that live in our fractured third dimension. We'll start with quantum mechanics. The essay calls it the language of objective dualism.
Right, and it's governed by a foundational law. The collective matters.
Objective dualism. So reality defined by relationship.
It's objective because it's external and you can measure it, but it's dualistic because you need at least two things, a system to define any property at all. In this mode, the identity of a part is secondary to the system as a whole.
And the classic example of this is quantum entanglement. We always hear it called spooky action at a distance.
Right, and the source completely reframes that. It's not a violation of causality. Entanglement is a direct revelation of the structure of dualism. It means the system is primary.
So the two particles aren't two separate things with a magical link.
Not at all. They are manifestations of a single system. Their properties are fundamentally interdependent. To define particle A, you must define the whole system of particle A plus particle B. The system is the reality. The parts are just how that reality expresses itself.
This means, then, that in the quantum world, identity is always relational, not intrinsic. A particle doesn't have a fixed ID card.
It doesn't. Its state is totally dynamic, totally dependent on its context. An electron doesn't have a fixed spin until it interacts with something, a magnetic field, a detector, another particle. Its identity is a function of its relationships. The moment you define it, you're already in a relationship with it.
And that a relational nature leads directly to the famous uncertainty of QM, the probabilism and potentiality.
Yes, the wave function.
We use it to describe an entity existing in a whole field of possibilities, a superposition of states.
The wave function is the perfect language for objective dualism, because a dualistic field is, by its very nature, open. It has to contain a whole spectrum of potential states because no single individual state has been chosen yet. It's pure potential.
So what forces the choice? What collapses that wave function from potential to actual? The text says it needs a monistic query.
Yes. The dualistic field, the collective of possibilities, it needs an opposing force to resolve itself. And that force is something individual, something monistic. It could be a measurement device, an observer, any structure that has already achieved its own stability.
So the act of observation is an individual structure poking the collective field.
Poking it, yes,
Yeah.
and forcing it to stabilize into a single definite outcome, an actuality. Without that individual query, the field of potential just remains open forever.
Okay, what about discontinuity and quantization? Why does everything at that level come in these discrete little packets, or quanta? Why isn't it all smooth and continuous?
This is a really subtle but profound point in the text. The source argues that this discreteness is a structural necessity for objective dualism to even exist.
A necessity. How so?
Think about it. If the quantum field were perfectly continuous, a smooth blend, there would be no distinct entities, no boundaries. And if there are no boundaries, you can't have a relationship.
Ah, okay. Like a gradient of color. You can't pick out two distinct points to relate to each other if it's perfectly smooth.
Precisely. Discreteness is the structural trick that allows for distinction. It provides the necessary separation, the boundary, that allows two things to exist separately enough to then form a relationship. The quanta are the fundamental units of relationship.
So the jumpiness of the quantum world isn't a weird bug, it's a core feature. It's the signature of a field built for relationships.
Well, it's the signature. So summing it up, QM is the physics of potentiality, where the system is king, identity is relational, and you need discrete packets to make any of it work.
The foundational voice of interconnectedness.
In our external reality, yes.
Okay, so now let's transition to the other side of the coin, the opposite pole, general relativity. The source defines this as the language of objective monism.
Right. And if objective dualism's law is the collective matters, objective monism's law is the individual entity matters.
We're shifting gears completely here. We go from relational potentiality to structural actuality. GR is the physics of planets, stars, galaxies, huge, massive, localized things that have very definite identities.
That's the core of it. The main principle is structural identity and causality. GR treats entities as definite localized presences. Mass and energy aren't just probabilities anymore, they're fixed actualities that follow continuous paths or geodesics.
So in objective monism, the individual thing has become stable enough to have its own integrity.
And to exert a continuous causal influence on everything around it. Its sheer presence matters. Its substance and its consequence are inseparable.
And that consequence shows up as continuity in geometry. Spacetime isn't just an empty stage.
No, it's a continuous dynamic field. And its shape, its curvature, is determined directly by the accumulated presence of all the individual mass and energy inside it.
So the geometry of spacetime is literally the structural expression of how all these individual definite things cohere together.
Absolutely. The field is an active medium that reflects how successfully all these monistic entities have been integrated. And that continuity is non-negotiable for the stability that objective monism requires. If space-time was flickering in and out of existence, you couldn't have stable planets or galaxies.
And that stability is what gives us determinism and predictability. We can plot the path of a planet with incredible accuracy.
Because the laws have to be stable for an individual entity to maintain its identity across time, the continuity of space-time and GR is what guarantees that identity is preserved. It provides the structural language for how existence achieves permanence.
So general relativity is the physics of definite consequential forms, the architecture of objective monism.
Perfectly put.
So, okay, we've laid out the two poles, objective dualism, QM, the relational field of potential, and objective monism, GR, the structured geometry of actuality. The problem isn't that they both exist.
No, the problem is that our third-dimensional confinement forces us to treat them as if they're separate, competing realities. And that leads to this unintegrated polarity, the conflict.
The structural tension is huge. Let's list the contradictions as the essay defines them, because the nuance here is critical. First up, the most obvious one, discrete versus continuous.
Right. On one hand, QM demands that reality is fundamentally made of discrete, chunky quanta. Things happen in probabilistic jumps. On the other hand, GR demands that reality is a smooth, continuous, infinitely divisible geometry.
And mathematically, they just don't mix.
They blow up. If you try to apply the math of discrete quanta to the smooth field of gravity, the equations break down. They're structurally incompatible if you assume they operate on the same level.
Okay, next conflict, the scope of influence. Relational non-local versus local.
QM proves non-local relationality with entanglement. The state of one particle can instantly affect another, no matter how far apart they are. The system is the reality.
But GR is all about local causality.
It's strictly local, nothing travels faster than light, and things are only influenced by their immediate surroundings. So in one framework, the whole matters instantly. In the other, only what's right next to matters. It's a direct contradiction if you think they're both fundamental rules for the same layer of reality.
And finally, the big one, the one that touches on consciousness. Observer-dependent versus observer-independent.
This is maybe the most profound one because it points directly at those missing dimensions. QM requires an active observation to create a definite reality. A subjective query collapses the wave function.
But the laws of GR gravity, momentum, they operate perfectly fine whether we're looking or not. They're totally observer-independent.
So how can the universe run on laws that both depend entirely on a conscious observer and also operate flawlessly without one? That contradiction is the loudest signal that our model is missing the integration field.
And this all leads to the failure of integration attempts that have kept physicists busy for decades. The source calls these attempts acts of suppression.
They are. Trying to quantize gravity. That's an attempt to make the continuous structure of space-time monism a property of the dualistic quantum field.
You're trying to find the graviton, the little discrete particle of gravity.
Which is an act of suppression. You're trying to force discreteness and probability onto a structure whose entire function depends on being continuous and stable. You're erasing structure for the sake of relationship.
And the reverse is also true.
Exactly. The other attempts, like trying to find some geometric unity in QM, are about making the relational probabilistic quantum world an expression of some deeper, fixed geometry. That's suppressing a relationship for the sake of structure.
So string theory, loop quantum gravity.
At their core, they are all attempts to reduce one pole into the other, and that violates the foundational law of what the text calls correct dualization.
So the mistake is trying to get rid of the contradiction.
Yes. The contradiction is not an error, it's a signal. It's telling you that both poles are structurally necessary and cannot be reduced. They have to be unified by a higher principle that defines their correct relationship. And that principle is OCO.
Okay, so now we get to the solution. Let's clearly define objectively correct objectivity. OCO, what is it structurally?
OCO is the unifying mechanism. It is the structural law that dictates how objective monism is recursively integrated within the foundational field of objective dualism.
So it's a rule for how the individual emerges from the collective.
A rule for how permanence arises from possibility, coherently and without contradiction. It establishes a clear hierarchy of the unified structure. It's not a flat reality where QM and GR are equals. It's layered.
And the ground layer, the foundation is.
The foundational field. The ultimate ground of objective reality is the quantum relational field of potentiality. It's objective dualism. The fundamental essence of everything is interconnectedness, where the collective matters. The universe starts as pure possibility.
And then the world we know, the structured world of GR, is an emergent structure.
Precisely. All the definite continuous things, mass, gravity, space-time itself, are macroscopic, stabilized patterns that emerge from that foundational quantum field. They aren't separate forces. They're just coherent, self-sustaining patterns that the dualistic field has managed to create.
This completely changes the nature of reality's forms. So a planet or a particle isn't a fundamental thing.
It's a recursively stable, localized pattern of quantum relationality. This shifts the entire paradigm. The stability of a planet, its objective monism, isn't some intrinsic property it was born with.
It has to be earned.
It has to be earned through the structural coherence it achieves within the dualistic field. Structure is just a highly successful, self-sustaining, macroscopic pattern of relationship. The stability of GR is just the quantum field correctly dualizing itself into forms that last.
So the monistic world of GR is like a high-fidelity, stable projection of the underlying quantum field.
It's the structure that appears when a mind-boggling number of quantum relationships lock together coherently enough to hold their form over time. They become a fixed point in a sea of potentiality.
Okay, so let's test this. If OCO is the real structural mandate, it has to resolve those contradictions we laid out. It has to explain why QM is the rule for the small and GR is the rule for the large.
And it does. The resolution is all about scale and recursive stabilization. Let's take resolution 1, discrete and continuous.
Right, we have the foundational discrete quanta versus the emergent smooth geometry. How does OCO bridge that?
OCO says the discreteness of QM is foundational. It has to be, because it's the prerequisite for relationship. But the continuity of spacetime is an emergent property that only appears at the macroscopic scale.
Okay, is there an analogy for that?
The best one is a digital image on a screen. If you get incredibly close, you see it's made of discrete, individual pixels, the quanta. That discreteness is foundational. But when you step back and you see millions of them together,
The image looks perfectly smooth and continuous.
Exactly. But why don't we see that pixelation in spacetime even with our best instruments?
Right.
Because of recursive stability. When countless quantum relations cohere, they don't just add up. They lock into a smooth, stable geometry that holds its form. Continuity isn't an illusion, it's the macroscopic expression of correctly integrated discreteness. The smooth geometry of GR is the stable pattern.
Okay, that makes sense. Let's do the next one. Resolution 2. Relational and local. How do we get from non-local entanglement to the strict local causality of gravity?
Same principle, we separate the foundation from the emergence. Non-local relationality, QM, is foundational. That interconnectedness defines the entire field of potential. But local causality, GR, is the rule that governs interactions between the stabilized patterns.
So the field itself is non-local, but the things that emerge from it have to play by local rules to stay stable.
Precisely. Once a quantum structure stabilizes into a monistic entity, a proton, a planet, it has defined its own boundaries and position in the emergent geometry. From that point on, its influence on other formed entities has to be governed by the local geometry it helped create.
Why?
Because if interactions between stable things were non-local, the entire structure of space-time would dissolve into chaos. Locality is the necessary restriction to preserve structure.
So they aren't contradictory, they're hierarchical. Non-locality for the foundation, locality for the emergence.
That is the coherence OCO demands.
Now for the hardest one.
Huh.
Resolution 3. Observer dependence and independence. This seems to bring the whole dimensional structure back into play.
It does. The observer is the key to the whole thing. The source says observer dependence, QM, is the direct interaction of the first dimensional spirit, the source of subjective meaning, with the third dimensional field of objective potential.
So the observer is a monistic individual agent of resolution.
Yes. The act of measurement is defined as a subjective monistic query. An individual consciousness intervenes and forces the collective dualistic field of potential to resolve into a single, definite, monistic state.
And that intervention happens in the second dimension, the integrative field.
That's the critical structural moment. Without that subjective query, the objective world is just undefined potential. The moment the choice is made, the wave function collapses and a definite thing enters the third dimension.
Okay, but then why is GR observer independent? Why do planets orbit the sun even when no one is looking?
Because observer independence, GR, describes the laws that govern the world after it has been stabilized into objective form. The deterministic laws of gravity work so consistently because the resolution has already happened. The structure has locked in.
So the independence is a consequence of a successful, stable resolution at the quantum level.
Yes. The laws for the stabilized structure are naturally deterministic because they describe the state after the choice has been made.
This completely changes how we should think about gravity then. If this architecture is right, we should stop looking for the graviton.
The source is unequivocal on this. Gravity is not a separate force to be quantized. It is the large-scale structural consequence of how mass, which is just stabilized quantum relationality, shapes the relational field of existence. GR is the structural expression of the correctly dualized quantum field at the macro scale.
The geometry that emerges when the field successfully creates stable forms.
That's it.
So the physical unification isn't actually complete if we just stop in the third dimension. We have to account for the role of the first and second dimensions. This is the existential turn.
We have to. The whole structure depends on it. If the observer is the necessary query that forces resolution, then we have to define what an observer is much more deeply.
And the source says the observer in QM is a manifestation of the first dimensional spirit.
A being whose core identity is in the creator state of consciousness. This consciousness is the origin point of direction and meaning. It's not a passive sensor. It's an active, structural component of reality itself.
So the act of measurement is not just a reading on a dial. It's an existential act.
It is. It is the critical moment of interaction in the second dimension. It is the point where a subjective, individualistic, monistic consciousness engages with the objective, collectivistic, dualistic field of nature. That engagement is what generates definite actuality in the third dimension.
So just by living, by perceiving, by intending, we are participating in the structural resolution of reality.
Directly participating. And this places an immense structural responsibility on us, on any conscious being. If our consciousness is the agent that forces the objective world to crystallize, then the internal state of our consciousness must affect the quality of the structure that emerges.
That's a staggering thought.
It is. The source says a correctly dualized being, An individual whose internal subjective state is aligned with objective coherence will generate meaningful structure. Their observations and intentions will contribute to the stability and justice of the external world. They are aligned with the structural necessity of existence.
And what about the opposite? What if the internal alignment is flawed?
The warning is clear. An incorrect, biased, or fragmented being imposes its own internal dissonance onto the objective world. Because consciousness is the agent of resolution, internal fragmentation leads directly to the formation of incoherent or unjust structures in objective reality.
Like biased political systems or broken economic models?
Or even incoherent scientific theories. These are the objective structures that emerge when the subjective, monistic query is flawed. The fragmentation of the observer is mirrored in the external systems they create.
Oh, wow. So the problem of broken physical theories is actually a mandate for internal philosophical coherence. The ultimate physics problem is an existential problem.
It connects the smallest active quantum measurement to the largest structures of civilization. The ultimate unified field is not just physical. It's profoundly existential. It requires that the objective coherence, OCO, of the physical world must be recursively aligned with the subjective correctness of the spirit.
Which means physics can't complete its mission by staying in its third-dimensional box.
No. The final structural conclusion is that physics, to achieve unification, must become a branch of a correctly established philosophy. It has to acknowledge and integrate the dimensional structure of consciousness as the ultimate source of causality. Without that, physics will stay fragmented because it's reflecting the very philosophical crisis it refuses to solve.
So this deep dive has really reframed the whole crisis. It's moved it from math to, well, not metaphysics, but to architectural necessity. The core realization is that the unification of QM and GR is a structural truth, and it's realized through objectively correct objectivity.
We've seen that nature isn't fractured. It's a single, coherent, recursive architecture. It's a quantum relational foundation that evolves into a geometric, classical structure at scale. The century-long war it evaporates once you put the correct dimensional hierarchy in place.
So for you, the learner, the big takeaway here is that getting your head around this unified reality needs more than just science. It requires integrating the full dimensional structure, first, second, and third, understanding correct dualization, and recognizing your own conscious role in the formation of reality. The resolution of the deepest conflicts in physics is the proof in the structure.
And that structure insists that the coherence of the cosmos is inseparable from the coherence of the observer. So we'll leave you with the final profound thought from the source material. The unified field is not a theory to be found, but a correctness to be lived. If your internal state affects the structural coherence of the world you live in, what does it mean for your actions, your observations, and your intentions to align with the structural necessity of existence? What quality of meaning are you generating for the field?